None of this is made explicitly clear, so I find myself feeling like a dog lost wandering in the woods half the time, but they took a few aesthetic missteps that cost them the whole turkey. But you can't defend yourself in this state, so you know what that means? Forced stealth in an action game.
We return you now to the most British man in the world.
He's dead. Welcome to the increasingly misnamed Medieval. No, seriously, I'll bring this up right away. It's called Medieval, but this game is set in Victorian England, so it's not really medieval anymore. Wait. Oh, I get it. It's a game about medieval times, but they spelled it like EVIL. It has a double meaning. Haha, funny joke. You see, it's funny because I'm just kidding. I'm not pretentious enough to act like I'm the only one who gets it. Medieval 2 then. So with the success of the first game, Medieval had established itself as one of the top PlayStation franchises in the late 90s heading into the new millennium. A sequel was expected and inevitable. So SCE Cambridge got to work on the follow-up to their breakthrough hit, coming out in April 2000 to positive reviews and moderate success. Success that was hampered slightly by the PS2 being on the horizon like most of the big releases in 2000. In fact, the PS2 was already out in Japan by April, so Medieval 2 was facing a bit of an uphill battle from the start. In fact, they were facing two uphill battles from the start because on the other hand, you had the matter of, what do we do now? The first game pretty much decisively ended with no loose ends to pick up from. Well, actually, there were very few ends, period, because of the weak story. And so there were no obvious directions you could take with the sequel. In the end, they took the easy way out and did a time jump. Medieval was set in 1386, well now we're jumping to the year 1886, 500 years after the events of the previous game. If I'm being honest, if I were a fan of the series when this was new, I'd be pretty disappointed that they jumped all the way to the late 1800s because there's not much further you could go before reaching the modern day. If at this point the series was taking the direction of a medieval skeleton rising from the dead to save the world every so often, they weren't leaving themselves open to much after this in terms of potential sequels. All things being equal, I think the Italian Renaissance of the 1400s would have been the next logical step, but as we know in hindsight, this would be the last medieval game to come out, and so it's a pretty moot point, though perhaps the lack of new time periods was the reason they stopped after 2. Who knows? Other than James Shepard, the creative director of the project. With that said, the game starts up and we get a brief recap to get players up to speed. Well, that's revisionist history. I remember Zarok looking like way more of a goof than that. So after finally being able to rest in peace, it's 500 years later and Daniel is now an exhibit in, I believe, the Museum of Natural History in Kensington, a district of London. So hold up. Wasn't Gallowmere, the setting in the last game, a fictional British region? So now between games we've somehow crossed over from complete fiction to contemporary fiction. That means one of two things had to have happened. Either the region of Gallowmere that Daniel was buried in became London in the intervening years and his tomb was converted into this spot in the museum, or his tomb was desecrated and his corpse was put on display. The former of which being pretty much impossible in a contemporary setting, as London was established in 50 AD, and as for the latter possibility, I feel like I'm overthinking this, but wouldn't the British even in the 19th century have qualms about desecrating the graves of their own? Probably not, let's be honest. Also, this is now 600 years after Daniel originally died. Forget being a skeleton, by this point we should be piloting around a pile of dust with one eyeball. Yeah, I'm definitely overthinking this. Anyway, some guy named Palethorn finds Zarok's spellbook and once again casts a spell to raise the dead. This throws London into chaos, but also raises Daniel from the dead. Will this guy ever be able to rest? So now we must once again right the wrongs of an evil sorcerer and save the world. According to some dialogues, Palethorn managed to recover some of Zarok's book, but other parts of the book are still lost. So now we have to find the missing pages before the bad guys can recover them and summon an evil being simply called the Demon. Wrong demon. Still wrong. To do this, Dan enlists the help of a motley crew of companions, including a magician, inventor, scientist, professor, and master of the occult named Hamilton Kift, so he's like a 19th century Tony Stark, but way less cool. Or a 19th century Elon Musk, but with dignity. And then you have this ghost of like a 10-year-old Cockney chimney sweep named, brace yourselves, Winston Chapelmount. It was pointed out to me that Winston Chapelmount is a play on Winston Churchill. Pretty clever. It's kind of like how the name Undertale is a play on the name Cave Story. Then later you're introduced to Daniel's love interest, the weirdly sexy mummy princess named Kia, and I mean weirdly sexy. I haven't had mixed feelings like this since the first, and only, time I watched Avatar. So that's your lot, and by my explanation, you can definitely see that the plot is more of a central focus this time around. You could have replaced most of the previous game with Dan slowly ascending a large staircase, and not much of relevance would have changed. It was the gameplay that held that game up. This time, there's a sense that they want to do more, and so you have a group of foes, a group of allies, and a race against time to collect the pages of Zarok's spellbook. Boom, a nice solid hole for the rest of the goings-on to jump off from. It's just that they build off that foundation with duct tape and termite-infested wood. First off, I think the most immediate thing that I don't like is that the primary joke surrounding Daniel is lost at this point. In the first game, the way the world saw Daniel had a humorous juxtaposition. He was considered a treasured hero by history, but in actuality was a walking, talking fuck-up, and that was a constant point of mention in the previous game. Ostensibly a hero, but was constantly getting the piss taken out of him by every sentient object that knew the truth.
The hero of Gallowmere who fell at the first charge. The fog of war and the shrouds of time conspire to turn the arrow fodder into the savior of the day.
But now 500 years later, he's just a hero with none of the added bits that made him endearing. He no longer has to live up to his own legend because he already has, and nobody will bring up his status as a bumbling goof who died to the first volley of arrows in battle. Either because everybody who knows isn't around anymore, people don't know, or people don't care. That's not a bad thing on its own, but they take away what made Dan endearing and don't replace it with anything. So he's just a flatline and basically a non-entity other than being the vessel that everything happens through and the guy expected to do everything. So all that charming wit that surrounded him and the characters he interacted with is gone. It's funny because this game actually has much more of a story focus than you'd expect, with a bunch of dialogue and cutscenes to set things up. Yet for something with as much dialogue as it has, nobody really has a personality other than Pale Thorn being a flustered sadist with anger management issues. Hell, I'm almost cheering for him because he's the only proactive one with a distinguishable personality. Dan used to be given a degree of personality by the way people interacted with him, but seeing as people now only treat him as the hero and the characters surrounding him are blank slates, he's just a brick wall being told what to do at this point. I couldn't tell you about Winston, he just says things.
And if you see my spectral trail, stand in the light and press action to summon me.
Kia has like 5 dialogue lines in the entire game, and her entire role in the game is to be a hot ass kicking around Hamilton's lab, ostensibly helping him with his inventions, and to be rescued by Dan twice, subsequently falling in love with him, which, now that I think of it, is kinda icky. Made ickier by the professor's only real personality being the fact that he makes several passes at her. Yikes. Though to be fair, he has 1 foot in the grave and the rest of them have 2 feet in the grave, so maybe it's not as bad as it seems. Elsewise though, he has no personality. One point that spells out to me how much of an impact a story leaves on me is how much I can remember completely off memory. I can remember big moments and a few broad strokes about Medieval 2, but if you were to ask me why in a minute sense half of these levels were happening, I couldn't tell you. It's not like these are stops on our way to the big bad like last time, because we're trying to intercept the big bad and find the missing pages before he does, but we never come out with any of the pages. We just go places, nothing of note happens, and then we come back. Okay, so the first level is just us making our way to Hamilton's lab, then the Kensington level I think involves us restoring power to his lab, and then we decide to open Kia's tomb because Pale Thorn's minions were going to, but then we got to it first. Then I think the Freak Show level is us continuing to restore power to his lab by getting more zombie juice. I think it's not made clear. Then I think we go to Greenwich Observatory to try and track down Pale Thorn. None of this is made explicitly clear, so I find myself feeling like a dog lost wandering in the woods half the time. The dialogue doesn't set up the story properly half the time, and it doesn't establish personality either, so what's even the point of all this dialogue? It's a wonder how they have so many cutscenes and so much dialogue, and yet I still find myself questioning what's going on. Astonishingly, you actually have interactions with the main villains this time around though. They're a constant presence in the game. Your first face-to-face interaction is in the Greenwich Observatory level when they're about to activate a machine that will locate the pages of the spellbook, and Dan crashes the party.
What the devil? No!
Figuratively and literally. In fact, at one point, they even come to you on your home turf. There's one point where you come back from one of the levels and everything's weird. First of all, Winston prompts you to save, which doesn't happen unless you're in the second part of a long level. But we're just coming back, aren't we? Then Hamilton isn't at his desk and all of the indicators are gone. What's going on? As it turns out, in one of the stranger moments in the game, Pale Thorn is launching an all-out attack on your hideout, so you need to build a Frankenstein's monster-type creature to fight Pale Thorn's most powerful monster in a boxing match? A boxing match that's very tongue-in-cheek. So we were expecting an invasion and instead we got a weird competition? Oh, I forgot, these games have pretensions of being funny, but where the last game was witty, this game's really going for the goofiness. Hell, when you're constructing the monster, one of the parts you grab is... the bum. A bum that's part of this train contraption that gets around by farting. Yeah, this entire sequence is really weirdly juvenile, but at the very least, Pale Thorn is being proactive, unlike Zarok. That's one of the main story beats that sticks out. Then there's the other main beat in the story, which really contrasts against this level. There's this weird aside that's honestly so weird, I don't think you're ready for it. It has nothing to do with the main plot, and it comes straight out of left field. I genuinely don't think you're ready for it. Do you think you're up for it? Alright. You see, pretty deep into the game, there are two psychic disturbances happening at once, one in Whitechapel and one in what's called Wilfram Hall. Dan goes to the latter and fights Dracula. And no, that is not the weird part, believe it or not. Kia then goes off to investigate Whitechapel, the other concurrent disturbance, against the wishes of everyone because she wants to see the world. She was trapped in a tomb, and she doesn't want to be trapped in the lab like she was trapped in the tomb. Yeah, honey, there are better times and better ways to see the world than investigating danger with no way to defend yourself, so they had to contrive a reason for her to be put into the line of fire, but blatant contrivance is just the tip of the iceberg. Here's the thing, if you know anything about the city of Whitechapel in the late 1880s, you can pretty easily predict what's going to happen, right? Alright, here it goes. Kia gets straight up murdered. Like, no take backsies murdered. Not only that, murdered by none other than Jack the fuck-mothering Ripper. Well, that's dark. Jesus Christ! It's a good thing this game doesn't have a subtitle because the perfect subtitle would be Tonal Whiplash. So after a bunch of inconsequential claptrap in the early game, Dan just abandons his quest. He's heartbroken. He doesn't care. But then the game fully commits to jumping the shark in the same way that so many stories have in the past. Based on everything I've said so far, if I were to tell you this game contains time travel, would you believe me? Well, it does. And it comes out of nowhere exactly as much as it sounds. There's a multi-level sequence where Dan constructs a time machine and goes back in time to kill Jack the Ripper, in the process saving Kia, and then fuses with himself, repeat, fuses with himself to become Super Dan. Everything I just said 100% actually happened. After that, the plot continues as normal into the final act. It tries to continue as if nothing happened. What the fuck? Look, I'm not gonna try and argue whether or not time travel should exist in a universe where we've already seen a bunch of magic and stuff. There are bigger fish to fry in that regard, but I will argue that time travel is a cheap trick to get out of a tight spot, and with few exceptions is usually the key warning sign of a series running out of ideas and or jumping the shark. That certainly applies here, but it's not implausible in this universe. Even then, my issues come in a number of flavors. One, it was contrived as hell. Kia decided to put herself in the line of danger just because she didn't want to be trapped in the lab like she was trapped in her tomb? Fuck off. 2, it had nothing to do with the story. Jack the Ripper had nothing to do with Pale Thorn, unlike Dracula, who was established to be in cahoots with Pale Thorn. 3, it was absolute tonal whiplash. The game tries to go for goofy, wacky BS one mission, and then tries to have a tragic death scene a few missions later. And 4, it ultimately didn't matter. It doesn't play into anything other than the time machine being a mild element in one of the two endings, and it just ends up being a distraction from the main plot to pad things out another few levels. If it were built to and made sense, it could have been a highlight, but it's ultimately the game's lowlight. All this for a woman he knew for like 5 minutes? It's another one of those really dumb forced relationships in fiction. I don't buy most relationships in fiction unless it's built over a long period of time, but making a believable relationship in a 2-hour movie or even a 6-hour game isn't believable when it's usually a long-term thing. Furthermore, it's usually a forced, studio-mandated element put in for maximum widespread appeal. But the whole believability factor is usually why more long-term content like TV shows usually have more believable relationships, but Dan throwing the world away for someone he knew for like all of 4 cutscenes is just the dumbest thing. And then there's the tonal issue. The previous game managed a balance between creepy and funny, but Medieval 2 tries to be wacky, creepy, melodramatic, and sappy, all within the space of a few missions. You throw these ingredients into a melting pot and you have an absolute mess. The sad thing is, Medieval 2 has some really good ideas. The underground race of creatures that worship Dan like a god makes for a fun level thematically. Pale Thorn is a good villain and usually interacts with you enough that he comes across as somewhat threatening. The whole race against time to collect the pages of Zarok's spellbook thing this game has going for it makes for a more compelling overarching plot than before. Then the world and characters are well realized and fun. You even have a bunch of optional dialogue and books to read through, which really helps build the world. Wow, history really doesn't remember Zarok as he was. The story had so much going for it, but Medieval 2 is a mess of tone, focus, and clear directions, which really sinks the whole ship. It tries to do more, but it also mishandles more. I don't know what else to say other than the narrative's a mess. They really tried, and I can appreciate that, but it seems the more they tried, the more they messed up. And that's a statement for the entire game, as a matter of fact. Back up though, this game looks great. With the increased scope and focus on story, that means they needed more dialogue, which means more cutscenes, but pre-rendered cutscenes were very expensive and consumed a lot of disk space, so Medieval 2 had to do what only a select few games were doing around this time and make in-engine cutscenes. Few games did it, and even fewer games were doing them this well. The presentation as a whole seems anomalously modern given the fact that it was on aging hardware, but that might even be why the presentation was so good. It was a late release, so they were able to fully utilize the system. The cinematography, the voice acting, it almost looks like someone down-converted PS2 or PS3 cutscenes for how ahead of its time it looks.
You don't! I've had enough of you slimy, whiny, get it! No matter. I'll call on my allies earlier than expected.
The voice acting I find especially impressive, and the craziest thing, this entire game only has 3 voice actors. Furthermore, Melanie Hudson only played one role. Kia, naturally, though she may have also played that other character in the whorehouse. Yes, I know it was a nightclub, but it looks like a whorehouse. This woman even refers to her girls, but she didn't get credited as such. Then Robbie Stevens is only credited for 2 characters, Jack the Ripper and Mander. This guy. The rest of the game is carried by Mark Silk, who plays every other named character, and holy hell, he does a great job. If you were to tell me these characters were all voiced by the same guy, I wouldn't believe you, but damn.
You made it! Nice one, Dane. If you meet that monster, don't be too scared. Look for his weak point.
No, not me. I'll quit.
No, Dan, that's just what he wants. If we give up now, all of London will be his. You never give up, do you, Dan? I knew you'd find the last page of Zarek's spellbook for me. You should have joined me.
They're all distinct, they all carry a hell of a lot of conviction, and they all sound authentic for what each character is. He carries the cutscenes, and the production value on all of these cutscenes are way ahead of their time. As for the rest of the game, it's at the upper limit of what the PS1 was capable of. It has large, detailed, and distinct environments with few, if any, loading times. The models are detailed and plentiful, everything looks great, all the while keeping the game running relatively smoothly. The pre-rendered cutscenes, though, they look just as creepy as before, if I'm being honest. The quality looks marginally better than before, if still hampered by the compression, but that doesn't help the fact that they decided to include realistically proportioned humans, something the first game helpfully avoided. This increased focus on the realism of the CGI cutscenes only puts a spotlight on the uncanniness of the CGI. In short, these cutscenes look marginally better quality-wise, but they took a few aesthetic missteps that cost them the whole turkey. It kinda goes to show the change in the design philosophy from the last game to this game. The last game was more fantastical and being the fantasy Middle Ages, and this game is more grounded in a level of reality, being in standard Victorian London with fantasy elements. Shifting gears now, a word for the soundtrack. Unmemorable. That is all. I'm kidding mostly. I haven't touched on the soundtrack in these games yet, but that's because they're all okay but resoundingly unmemorable to me. This game's soundtrack has a gothic feel to it, which is nice, but it's also a very passive soundtrack meant as ambience to set the tone, which I can dig, and these games have great atmosphere, but that does also mean that I've utterly forgotten the soundtrack by the time I turn off the game, just because it blends into the scenery. There are a few standout tracks, but nothing I can really sink my teeth into. And that just leaves one thing. I don't know why. It doesn't even matter how hard you try. Keep that— okay, I'm gonna stop that riff before it gets gone. As far as the gameplay goes, let it be known that everything that was good about the first game is still good here. If you played these games back to back, you might be tired of the gameplay by this point, but that's a very subjective point. The focus on simple, fast-paced combat is still here, and is still as good as ever. The combat does feel weightless, like the sword that Dan swings around is made of the same ghostly essence that his pal Winston is made of. You know, it doesn't feel like he's struggling against the weight of his own sword, and the impact you should get from hitting enemies just isn't there. It feels no different both in terms of audio and visuals whether or not you hit something, but it's fast-paced enough that it's excusable. You, as well as all the enemies around you, move very quickly, so these fights come and go like dust in the wind. It moves too fast for you to really think about it or really to register the impact, and quite frankly, the pace is what saves this game in many instances. You'll find that when the pace drops, everything that's bad about this game is suddenly put under a microscope. In many ways, this game feels archaic in the way it controls and the way the gameplay is presented, and if you don't already have a predisposition for liking PS1 style games, then this game definitely isn't for you, but it's something that I can enjoy at the very least. The primary gameplay loop is compelling to play, so it's just satisfying to chop down all of these Yanks like piles of meat with bad teeth in the heat of battle. Plus, every level has a unique selection of enemies to deal with, and they're more creative than your standard zombies or imps, both in terms of design and how you fight them, so tactics vary mildly as the fight rages on. It's not the greatest system in the world, but it works for what it is. As you slit up more and more of Palethorn's minions, you'll fill up the chalice in any given level with the souls of the damned. Once you fill up the chalice to 100%, you can grab it and exchange it at Hamilton's workshop for a new weapon. Of course, the general act of slashing up fools would get old quickly if it were just the one weapon from the start of the game that you were expected to use all the way through, but assuming you can grab these chalices as you go, you'll have a constant supply of new weapons to play around with, so they keep the combat fresh and varied throughout by giving you all of these new weapons, assuming you can make the effort to get them. Of course, if you don't know to get all the weapons, you'll quickly be outclassed by the enemies and hazards, which hit harder as the game goes on, so you'll need every advantage you can get to keep pace. In fact, that's something the player needs to understand before they start playing. You need to collect every chalice and every health upgrade, otherwise you'll be rapidly outclassed by everything around you. Okay, I say every chalice, but you might want to leave one just in case. I'll explain why in a minute. So if a player doesn't know to do this, the game might seem harder and much less varied than it would otherwise, creating a mutually necessary commitment. Once you choose to play the game its way, the game only gets better. Getting over that hump may be a bridge too far, but I will always prefer a deliberate experience that expects you to play a certain way over something that tries to go for maximum variety. If you decide not to kill these enemies, you're borrowing from the future, as you won't get upgraded weapons, then fall behind. So the more you go above and beyond, the more fun and more varied the game will be. If you can get into the simple setup of Medieval 2 at its worst, it'll only get better as it goes on. The weapons in this game are really fun to use and offer a good amount of variety. There's a number of returning weapons from before, such as the swords, which are just as slashy as ever, and then there's the big hammer, and that whole Mjolnir thing that I mentioned before was apparently more apropos than I thought.
Try the hammer of Thor. You're sure to have a smashing time.
Go figure. Daniel's worthy. Then you have some new weapons like the cane stick, which is a pokey weapon, so the standard attack is tough to use, but if you fully charge it, there's a 3-pronged wave attack that auto-tracks, which is really useful when you're being swarmed. Medieval 2 also has a much bigger focus on ranged combat, which makes sense because the late 1800s was when guns were starting their transition from archaic flintlock-style guns to the more modern style, as far as I know anyway. I don't know much about guns because I'm not American. So with the guns being more common, it makes sense that they're your main means of ranged combat, so you have like 6 varieties of guns, which replaces the more unique ranged weapons from before. Many more flying enemies are around this time around, which you're expected to shoot instead of fruitlessly attempting to hit them melee style, but as far as the active usage is concerned, the guns act no differently than the ranged weapons from before as far as shooting is concerned. Furthermore, meaning that you're still expected to refill ammo, and ammo does not come cheap, especially on top of all of the other things you're expected to buy. So where the last game had it where you could get through with thousands of coins left over, I found myself going broke way more often this time around. The balance of amount of ammo you need to use versus how expensive it is way off. It's way too expensive, especially if you go into the effort of getting the Gatling gun. You might as well just save all the Gatling gun ammo you have when the weapon is gifted to you for the final boss. Beyond that, you might as well just gut it out and not use ranged weapons unless you absolutely need to, but at least the shop is fun. Before it was just about finding special gargoyles, where this time there's a reoccurring guy named Spiv who mills about and waits for you to shop. Does this guy remind you of anyone?
What are you buying? What are you selling? Ah, I'll buy it at a high price.
Furthermore, one of the things that returns from the last game are the Scavenger Hunts. This game is much more linear than the previous game, and so there's no instances of backtracking. Thank Yahweh. Everything you need at any given level is within that same level. The solutions to these scavenger hunts are also more realistic than collecting arbitrary runes that work on arbitrary gates. Not all the things you need to collect have some sort of realistic use, but there's actual realism in play. Somewhat, which makes these puzzles actually have some sort of logic, but also inadvertently takes away some of the magic. So Medieval 2 is at its most basic level, the same as the first Medieval, and if you enjoy the basic loop from the first game, Medieval 2 offers the same gameplay and the same experiences that you've gotten used to. I thankfully like the basic loop, so I can enjoy whatever this game throws at me. In theory. Now that's a loaded statement if I ever said one. The unfortunate thing is, Medieval 2 suffers from a terminal case of sequelitis. It does the very standard sequel thing, where it has to be bigger and badder, often to a fault, so it takes the relatively simple setup from the previous game and starts throwing shit at the wall to see what sticks, and I hate to say it, but everything new kinda falls flat for me. Like, they made a thing out of how Dan can remove his head, and this plays into the game twofold. Having birds that can swoop down and steal your head, and using your head to solve puzzles. First off, I hate the birds that steal your head. You know, I only played this game once before, and I'd completely forgot about this. I feel like I blocked it out of my memory. These are large environments, so it seems every time I've gotten my head stolen, I just wander around for 15 minutes trying to find out where it was. You can see from your head's perspective, but the low draw distance crossed with the one angle you get to see means it can be very tough to find your head.
Gives new meaning to the phrase, don't lose your head. Yeah, don't lose your head. Lest you waste your goddamn time.
And when you don't have your head, you have to deal with these scuttly, alien-looking bastards that hop onto your neck stump and just arbitrarily take some of your health away. These are one of the worst enemies in the game. They're hard to hit, they'll possess the bodies of the dead to make them infinitely respawn until you absolutely destroy the bodies, and once they're attached to you, you can't get them off of you. It's up to them how long they're attached to you, and it can turn into an infinite loop. It's awful. You need to get your head back. Usually this leads into the high areas, which in turn plays into Medieval's weird obsession with ladders. The ladders are everywhere, you climb slow, and it's hard to climb down on them. Half the time the collision will fail and you just fall right off, usually killing you instantly. Ladders are never good in games because nobody ever seems to be able to make the collision right. This is no different, and anything that kills you instantly out of your control can suck it. But then there's part 2 of the head mechanic. It's used for puzzle solving, like you might need it to get a better angle of things in tight spaces, like the positioning of these levers, but throughout the game you'll notice these little monster hands laying around. Then once they introduce the separating head mechanic, you can put your head on one of the hands to get around tight spaces and infiltrate locked areas. It's called the Dan hand. But you can't defend yourself in this state, so you know what that means? Forced stealth in an action game.
Happy, happy, joy, joy. Happy, happy, joy, joy. Happy, happy.
Ah yes, that old chestnut. The pace-killing, boring, forced chestnut that cursed action gaming for over a decade. This was probably one of the earlier examples of forced stealth because Thief was only a few years old at this point. You see, the movement controls aren't too good in this game. It works well enough when you're out in the open and are fighting hordes of enemies. Fighting hordes of enemies is usually when this game is at its best in general, but Daniel's controls are very unwieldy. There's no precision to how he moves, and there's no momentum, so relative to the position of the analog stick, he is moving as fast as he ever will when you push it. Basically, as soon as you move the analog stick, it's more of a strong suggestion rather than you directly controlling Daniel, so when you need precision, like for example in a section of forced stealth where the difference between getting away and getting throttled is a matter of split-second timing, it's like pulling teeth. In this section, I knew exactly what I was supposed to do, but then found myself getting caught over and over. Why? Because I was having the hardest time moving under or staying under this table. Then I was thrown out and had to try again. And again. They go crazy with this mechanic deeper into the game. There's the later section where you need to steal the time stone from the underground race of worshippers, and you have to solve puzzles to free yourself. Even before that, you need to use this mechanic to get pieces of a time machine, and with the severe reduction in your hitbox size but with the same midair movement speed, the platforming is flat out bad. I mean, the platforming generally isn't too bad, but as the Dan hand, it's awful. It's obnoxious that every time you need to use the Dan hand mechanic, it utterly changes the core gameplay because it eliminates the combat and reduces the movement speed, drastically slowing the pace. So the Dan hand takes away the two things that prop Medieval up. These games are at their best when you're at the heart of the action and the action is fast-paced. The Dan hand's not an idea without merit, and there are one or two clever uses of it, but by and large, it's a bad idea implemented poorly, and it's used a lot. Now, one of the big differences between Medieval 1 and 2 is that 2 has significantly bigger levels. There's one level early on, Kensington, that's an actual city district for you to walk around and explore. There's very little loading time and a bunch to discover. It feels like a real place that could exist. It's very impressive. Or Whitechapel is another level that's basically an entire city for you to roam around and explore, and it's a massive level for you to wander about, all the while evading these old school looking cops. Pretty much every level is expansive and has a lot going on. From a technical perspective, Medieval 2 is very impressive, but I'm not sure if bigger levels really benefits the game. In the first game, the levels were somewhat small, but they were compact. Everything that needed to be there was there, and there wasn't much dead space. When you increase the scope of the game, you're walking a fine line. On one hand, you can make the game feel more epic if you do it right, but on the other hand, you might end up creating a pointless commute between important set pieces if you do it wrong. Let's take Crash of the Titans and Mind Over Mutant as an equivalent. Crash of the Titans was level-based and very tightly designed. There was rarely a break in the action because they had a structured, deliberate design, but then with Mind Over Mutant, which was a sort of sandbox, you have the same amount of action just with long gaps of nothing between periods of action. Obviously, Medieval 2 isn't a sandbox, but it's the same idea, same amount of action spread over a larger area, so really, I don't think this game benefits from larger levels. It's so big that sometimes you need to save when you enter the second half of a level. They're so overly big that sometimes it can be a challenge to find the chalice, which by all rights aren't the type of things that should be hidden or hard to find. Like in the Kensington level, you just have to stumble and bumble your way into ringing the bell that summons it. Or there's the Whitechapel level, which has a bunch of interchangeable buildings for you to go into. Once again, you just need to stumble into finding the chalice boner first. But tish. In fact, you can tell they went for size over quality because the game is obnoxiously linear, and including boss arenas, there's only 15 levels where the first game had 22. I don't want to keep comparing the two games, but the first game keeps outdoing the sequel in the most basic ways. You have less variety and more obnoxious to navigate levels in 2. Bigger is not always better, regardless of what modern sensibilities will tell you with all the never-ending sandboxes we keep getting, and the same applies to games even this far back. But in one of the paradoxically more modern aspects in this game, it utilizes dual-stick camera controls. Obviously standard today, but at the turn of the millennium, this was groundbreaking and pretty much unheard of. It must have been one of the first games to do so, and it controls like any game you might see today, except you can't invert the controls, and I'm a hardwired up, down, up kind of guy, but don't look a gift horse in the mouth and all that. So in spite of the gameplay jankiness and moderate archaic nature, the camera is very good, and with the open nature of these levels, it's not getting caught up on the scenery, so if anything, the camera is really good in this game, which was a necessary improvement as far as I'm concerned, and then there's the other improvements that I'm really in favor of, like how in some specific instances of platforming over deadly pits, falling in only does a bit of damage. But then there are other instances where falling in still does a full bar of health, so cheers for consistency. Yay. That makes these pits more effective than any enemy in the game. Still, yay for small victories, but then boo for big losses because the health system is actually now worse than the previous game, and the health system was already shithouse in the last game. The health carries over between levels, which is never not a pain in my ass. It was commonplace around this time, but I still never liked it. It just ensures that eventually you're gonna hit a wall and have to replay previous levels to refill your health before proceeding. Except no you won't, because this game makes one of the most backwards ass design decisions I've ever seen. Not only does your health carry over between levels, but they also don't refill health wells when you return to previous levels. Once that well is tapped, that's it. It's gone forever. I've said about Medieval 1 that every time you get hit, you're borrowing from the future because eventually you're gonna have to go back and refill your health, but with 2, you're actively borrowing from the future. Every time you get hit, and you will get hit, it's inevitable, that health is gone forever and there's nothing you can do to get it back. There's no way to refill your health once these wells are tapped. I can't even begin to articulate how fucking pissed this makes me. So you can get most of the way through the game and then just not have enough health to continue. Fuck you! Hitting a wall in the last game was a waste of time. Hitting a wall in 2 is potentially game ending. I hate this. Do you understand how horrible this is? Words can only do it so much justice. So having you go through the late stages of the game with instant death falls, bullshit traps, powerful enemies, and so on and so forth, well, I had no way to heal myself for the road ahead, so the only option I had was to restart the game and just hope to take less damage. Unless I cheated. Yep, full disclosure, I didn't want to start the game from scratch, so I used a cheat to restore my health. I'm not ashamed to admit that I had to cheat. Simply put, this game wasn't giving me a choice. I had to refill my health one way or another.
I would replay previous missions to refill my health, but I couldn't, so I did what I had to do. I would if I could, but I can't. Shoulda, coulda, woulda. Hey, Macarena! Seriously though, fuck this health system.
This might come across as weak justification, but this is no different to what I would do otherwise. I'm just cutting out the middleman of having to replay earlier levels. Am I happy I had to do this? Fuck no. But it is what it is. The funny thing is, for all this game's paradoxical bad design, it had a lot of good ideas, and pretty well every level was unique in some way, tonally and gameplay-wise. Kew Gardens had all those mutant pumpkins that were mutating the innocent people, so you needed to cure them to keep your chalice percentage up. Then you had multi-level platforming, increased verticality, and the giant pumpkins that did massive oh. That wasn't very fun, was it? That and the fact that most of these giant pumpkins came out of nowhere, and the backtracking in this level was pretty bad. How about Dankenstein? Incidentally, Dankenstein is probably the worst level name I've ever heard. Now, here's the thing. I know what they were going for. They were trying to go for a combination of Dan and Frankenstein, so they made Dankenstein. But Dankenstein sounds like if Frankenstein was a stoner. Boosh. In this level, you have to construct a Frankenstein's monster from sentient limbs. Oh, but the time limit is kind of narrow, and the platforming challenge to get the chalice is really obnoxious. That and the fact that it feeds into the Iron Slugger boss fight, which is jank city. Even while being charming in that you can knock off all of each other's limbs and still fight with any combination of limbs, it's only slightly better than Yeti boxing, for all that's worth. Whitechapel's pretty fun, where you have to find a membership card, a beard, and a suit. There's some real head scratchers that are really satisfying to figure out puzzle-wise. Except this level is also really big. You can be lost wandering around samey-looking buildings while invincible cops, or rather peelers, chase you with admirable gusto. I don't think there's any way for you to get them off your tail once they start chasing you, other than temporarily knocking them out. Wilfram Hall is pretty good. You got the doors that open in sequence, and the puzzle surrounding pushing these vampires into the sunlight. But then there's also the terrible Dan Hand bit. Then there's the Greenwich Observatory level with some really fun and unique puzzles, but then some of the platforming is stretched unrealistically thin, and this is also the level where you're introduced to the head mechanic, and yeah, nothing else is really coming to mind. It seems like every time they tried to go for a gimmick level, it blew up in their faces. But you know, there are some good levels that are standard, the museum level for example, or the Freak Show, or Kensington. It seems like the game is really good, if a little bit meandering, right up until they introduce the detachable head. Then the quality takes a nosedive in all major aspects. The gameplay just keeps swinging and missing, and the story goes 8 ways loony by the end. At the very least, there's one major highlight I can point to. As much as I hate the whole Jack the Ripper thing from a story perspective, it's actually a really great boss gameplay-wise. He turns invisible and charges all over the place, only becoming vulnerable in very specific instances. Then he'll attack Kia, and you have to use the good lightning to heal her with your life force, which contextually makes much more sense than the whole good lightning bit from the first game. It's a tough boss with a bunch of moving pieces, but it's a great boss, unlike the other notable boss fights in the game. Easily the highlight of the gameplay. But you make it all the way to the end and fight through the toughest and most bullshit levels of them all. Every frustrating element this game had up to this point is here in spades and then some. Can anybody say falling oil? Oh yeah, we could tell you need to press a button to use the shield with finite health, I might add, to block the oil, but I figured we'd just let you figure that one out on your own. In the end, you blow up the cathedral, and what do you know, Pale Thorn gets the final page anyway and successfully summons the demon.
Oh no, he's hot!
The boss fight is only really tough because your window to damage the demon is super limited, and otherwise you have to dodge a buttload of attacks. You have to wait until Pale Thorn's airship is around to attack it, and then you have to attack it enough so that it'll malfunction, shooting the demon. So you want the weapon that'll load as much damage into Pale Thorn as possible. In this case, the final weapon, the Gatling gun, is your best bet. Do this several times while avoiding an endless wave of attacks, and the demon and Pale Thorn's undoing will ultimately beat each other. Pale Thorn then tries to blow you up, ultimately failing, and Dan meets up with Kia and... Wait, I don't remember this happening.
What?
Yeah, perplexingly, if you get all the chalices, you get the bad ending, but if you win without getting all the chalices, you get the good ending, which is a mawkish scene where Dan and Kia descend into her tomb. Together forever. Ugh. I'm not a fan of either of these endings, but it goes to show you how tonally inconsistent Medieval 2 is when the two endings are on polar opposites of the tonal spectrum. And that was a very conflicting game. The more I think about this game, the more I think it wasn't tested very well. It's not glitchy or anything, but the design has so many dumb oversights and badly executed ideas. At its core, it's still the same game with the same good and bad aspects, but there's so many layers that you have to get through to get to that good or that bad. They didn't really fix any of the issues I had with the previous game, and in 2, most of what they added on top of that only serves to make things worse. Hell, there are things they made exponentially worse that were already bad, like the health system. In the end, the result being a game that I really wish I could have liked more than I did. It really tried to keep a lot of balls in the air, but the new balls that they added are the ones that ultimately made the juggler lose focus. Between all of these issues and the sudden 500-year time jump eliminating most potential story ideas, I feel like Medieval 2 was a game that blew the series' load and killed any chance for further sequels. And maybe, just maybe, that was for the best. This video was brought to you in part by my lovely patrons. I thank you for your continued support. If you want to become a patron for TGX, the link is in the description.
Ugh, that looks like Zarok's O phase. If I look unshaven, it's because, god damn it, I was supposed to be somewhere today and I was going to film tomorrow, but I was going to shave tonight, but fuck it. I'm just, whatever. I'm not putting this off any longer. I don't mind looking like a bit of a bum in one of my videos, frankly, because I was looking a bit of a bum